Deep in the forests of northeastern Quebec, Route 389 cuts through a city-shaped absence, a clean grid of empty streets, laid out for a town that is no longer there. Pull back, and the shape gets stranger. The highway does not skirt an old ruin. It runs through the outline of a modern town. Homes, schools, municipal roads, an arena, and more than 4,000 residents. This was Gagnon, Quebec. 40 years ago, this was an iron mining town tied to one of Quebec's great industrial projects. Today, the buildings are gone, not slowly swallowed by decay. Not left as a normal ghost town. Gagnon was legally dissolved by the Quebec government on June 30th, 1985, and then systematically demolished. A whole municipality was turned from a hometown into a liability, and then into cleared ground. So the question is why, once Gagnon was doomed, anyone spent the effort to erase it completely. That choice changes the story. Abandonment is cheap, at least at first. You lock the doors, stop mowing the grass, let windows break, and let weather work. Demolition is different. It costs money, planning, legal permission, crews, machines, and a reason strong enough to turn a town into cleared land. Gagnon is not a mystery about a place nobody cared about. The source trail points to a colder structural question. When does a town become more expensive to keep than to remove? The first clue is on the map, at Lac Janine, the iron ore body that made the town necessary. From there, the trail runs through Quebec Cartier mining and the larger world of North American steel, through the early 1980s downturn that squeezed an operation already under pressure, through the 1985 Act that dissolved Gagnon as a municipality, and finally to demolition, where buildings, services, and future obligations were physically removed. None of this requires a hidden disaster or a secret map. The available records point through ordinary categories: ore, company accounts, maintenance, liability, and a government stamp. To understand why the stamp mattered, we have to go back to the thing that gave Gagnon a reason to exist. The chain begins with iron, buried near Lac Janine in the interior of northeastern Quebec. In 1960, Gagnon was incorporated as a new municipality, not because settlers had slowly gathered at a crossroads, but because Quebec Cartier mining needed a permanent base for a remote iron ore operation. Quebec Cartier was tied into a much larger industrial chain, with links to US steel and North American demand for raw material. The ore would be dug, processed, moved out by rail, and fed into a steel economy far beyond the forest. To keep that machine running, the company needed people willing to live hundreds of kilometers from older cities, through long winters, in a place where the mine explained the road, the power lines, and the town plan. So Gagnon could not be just a camp of bunkhouses. It had to function as a real town. Streets were laid out, houses were built, schools gave families a reason to stay. Recreation facilities, including an arena, turned an industrial outpost into a place with routines, weekends, teams, and civic life. If you wanted a stable workforce in a remote mining region, you had to build more than a pit and a payroll office. That is what makes the empty grid so jarring. Gagnon was modern infrastructure, but it was also municipal life. Homes, classrooms, roads, services, and a name on official maps. Its disappearance was the removal of a planned functioning town built to make extraction possible. Built into that design was the bargain that would eventually turn dangerous. Ore body, mine, company payroll, town services. Every ordinary part of Gagnon depended on that chain holding together. The same chain that built Gagnon also made it vulnerable. In a company town, the mine is not one employer among many. It is the anchor under almost everything. The paychecks come from the mine. The demand for houses comes from the mine. The municipal tax base, directly or indirectly, depends on the industrial operation that brought the people there. Even the future of a school or an arena is tied to whether families believe the work will still be there next year. When the system is working, that arrangement can look solid. A company gets the labor force it needs in a remote region. Workers get steady wages, paved streets, services, and a town built faster than a normal settlement could have grown. For families, Gangneon was not a line item. It was where children walked to class, where teams played at the arena, where addresses and routines became ordinary. On the company ledger, though, the town sat inside a colder calculation. As long as iron ore moved, the mine produced, and the market bought what came out of the ground, Gangneon made sense as infrastructure. If any part weakened, the same houses, roads, sewers, lights, and public buildings could move to the other side of the ledger. That does not mean every company town is doomed, or that Gangneon was fake while people lived there. It means its permanence depended on something narrower than most towns depend on: one ore body, one corporate owner, and one commodity market. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the first pressure point was not political, it was geological. The ore that had justified Gangneon was running out. The ore that had justified Gangneon was running out in the most literal way, not as a slogan or rumor, but as the mine life of Lac Janine reached its end. On a map, the dependency is blunt. Here is Gangneon, the town. Here is Lac Janine, the operation that gave the town its reason to exist. Farther along the same industrial geography was Fire Lake, another iron ore site that could keep some mining activity alive. But the record does not support treating it as a simple replacement for the original equation that built a whole municipality around Lac Janine. A mine is not like a factory that can be retooled for a new product. It is a finite deposit, being consumed shift by shift. In mining, the accessible and economically attractive ore may be worked before the more difficult material. By the end of a mine's life, what remains can be harder or less attractive to extract, especially when prices and demand are no longer forgiving. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Lac Janine was no longer the engine it had been when Gangneon was planned in 1960. That changed the meaning of the infrastructure around it. The houses were still houses, the school was still a school, the streets still needed grading, plowing, lighting, and repair. With the mine beside the town producing less industrial value, the town's infrastructure could begin to look less like support for production and more like an obligation attached to a shrinking operation. Fire Lake mattered. Under worsening conditions, though, it did not sustain Gangneon as the original Lac Janine operation had. The first crack in Gangneon's future was not a bulldozer or a law. It was the quiet arithmetic of a deposit nearing depletion. Then the pressure moved beyond Lac Janine. At the same time Lac Janine was fading, the wider steel economy was beginning to buckle. Ore depletion was local. The next pressure came from outside the forest. Gangneon was remote, but it was not insulated. The town sat at the far northern end of a long industrial chain. Iron ore pulled from Quebec, processed and shipped into a steel economy that depended on construction, manufacturing, rail, cars, machinery, and mills far outside the forest. When North American steel weakened in the early 1980s, that weakness traveled backward through the chain. Less steel demand meant less appetite for iron ore. Weaker commodity conditions gave a mine already losing its original deposit less room to absorb costs. For a company town, the cost picture reached beyond trucks, crushers, rail links, and payroll. Look back at the grid. Streets to clear in winter, houses tied to buyouts and upkeep, sewers and power lines under a municipal boundary, public buildings that still needed security and maintenance after the main industrial reason had faded. This is why Gangneon cannot be reduced to a simple morality play. The decision to erase the town was a choice, made by institutions with power over residents' lives. The record also places that choice inside a real industrial collapse, as steel producers across North America were cutting and consolidating under pressure. In that climate, the map of Gangneon started to read differently. The grid that once proved the company could build a modern town in the wilderness now represented obligations stretching across emptying streets. The exact savings from demolition are not clearly pinned down in the public record. What is visible is the decision logic. If the mine was no longer the engine, every road, pipe, building, and lot still had to be managed. By the mid-1980s, Gangneon was no longer only a town with a depleted mine. It had become a municipal boundary around costs the system was preparing to end. That is when the story moves from markets and balance sheets into law. The legal turn arrived on June 30th, 1985, when Gangneon was officially dissolved by the Quebec government. Before the houses came down, before the streets emptied into the forest, the town disappeared as a municipality. Its legal existence ended first. The place where people paid taxes, voted locally, sent children to school, and received town services was converted into an administrative file with an end date. This was not a secret disappearance or an illegal bulldozing carried out in the dark. The erasure passed through government authority, with the Quebec National Assembly providing the legal framework for the town's dissolution. That distinction matters because it makes the story more unsettling. Gagnon was not removed outside the system. It was removed through the system. For residents, the legal process became relocation. Homes were bought out. Families had to leave a town that, on paper, had been built as a permanent civic place, but in corporate and municipal records remained tied to the life of the mine. A buyout could settle the value of a house. It could not preserve the street it sat on, the neighbors around it, or the municipal identity attached to an address. After the law cleared the way, demolition followed the liquidation logic visible in the records. Empty buildings still require security. Roads still invite maintenance. Water and sewer systems still carry responsibility. A standing town, even without a mine, can keep producing costs. The chosen solution was not to let Gagnon decay into a normal ghost town. It was to remove the obligations themselves: houses, civic buildings, infrastructure, and the visible proof that a municipality had stood there. By the end, the sequence had moved from depleted ore and market pressure to legal dissolution and physical removal. Gagnon had been erased twice, first on paper, then on the ground. After the legal stamp, the cost stops being abstract. A town is not only its legal status, and not only its buildings. For more than 4,000 people, Gagnon was the map of daily life, a school route across the grid, a neighbor's door down the street, arena lights in winter, addresses that made sense because routines and names were attached to them. A home buyout could help a family leave. It could not move the town with them. When Gagnon disappeared, residents lost more than shelter. They lost a municipal identity, the ordinary civic frame that tells a person where they are from. Schools were no longer places children would return to as adults. Streets stopped being shared reference points. The arena, the public buildings, and the familiar pattern of errands and seasons all became past tense at once. This is the part a balance sheet cannot measure cleanly. It can list houses, roads, water systems, taxes, maintenance, and security. It can estimate what an empty municipality might cost. It has no clean line for the disappearance of a hometown. Gagnon is extreme because the erasure was so complete. Many resource towns decline slowly. Some shrink, some adapt. Some remain as small communities after the boom. Gagnon shows the harsher edge of the single resource bargain, when one mine, one employer, and one commodity support almost everything. The town can become vulnerable the moment that chain breaks. For the company and the state, closure was a process. For residents, it split life into before and after. The mine left first, then the municipality, then the buildings. What remained was memory, records, and a shape in the forest waiting to be understood from above. Back above Route 389, the shape finally reads as evidence. Route 389 still cuts through the former town site, and the old geometry has not entirely disappeared. In the forest, you can still read the outline of streets that once organized houses, schools, errands, and winters. By now, the empty grid is no longer just a strange image. It is the last visible layer of a chain: ore, company, market, law, demolition. Gagnon was built because Lac Genin made a town useful. It was weakened when that ore body ran down. It was squeezed harder when the steel economy turned against remote iron towns like this. And in 1985, after the municipality was legally dissolved, the remaining town became something the system no longer needed to carry. The exact amount saved by removing Gagnon is not clearly established in the records available here. What is clear is the direction the decision took. Buildings, roads, services, security, taxes, and maintenance were no longer treated as the infrastructure of a future community. They were treated as obligations to be ended. So Gagnon was not simply abandoned. It did not fade slowly into ruin. It was a modern town created for extraction, then removed when extraction no longer justified the town. That is why this road through the forest feels so strange. It is not passing through wilderness untouched by history. It is passing through a place where an industrial empire once built a hometown, then erased almost everything that made it visible.